up a little bit. So first, I'm a music nerd, so I like to speak in song, communicate through song, metaphor often. And so one that had me last year was just thinking, Marvin Gaye, what's going on? I think like 2012 had so many moments of just like, what in the is going on? And by the end of the year, I felt like it had just switched from what's going on to just straight like saying mercy, mercy me. Because I just like, throw my hands up, like I don't know, what the world is coming to. So in that context, and I feel like mental health has now been at the forefront of the conversation, again, specifically in the gun control debate with regards to individuals. But I wanted to take a step back to the meta of thinking, looking at the mental health of our politics and just how we're operating as a nation, and because I feel like there is a lot of cause for concern. And so I just wanted to get some people's opinions on that. And Michael, I'm going to defer to you first as our mental health expert. But yeah, I would love to hear people's thoughts on just kind of where you see us culturally.
Through the book, what don't we have as a nation?
Yeah.
Anxiety disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, ADD. We have all of it, because we're trying. Politically, we're trying to appease way too many people, and not in the sense of coming together and compromise. We're trying to appease really crazy people. Like the Tea Party is, and I say this as a practicing crazy person, they are crazy, and they stick to this stringent ideological framework from which they're negotiating, but it's not about negotiation, it's about how long will it take to break Obama, to break the Democrats, so that we can impose this agenda that is draconian, that is going to it's going to gut every program that we have here in America and send all of our dollars overseas in the form of bombs. That's the agenda from Tea Party candidates and their supporters. And so we're trying to negotiate with them, and it's making the rest of us crazy, because we get frustrated. It's like, you're supposed to come to the table in good faith and negotiate, and we can't get anywhere. And so you start with the Tea Party in that sense, and then we talk about the polarization of America and talk about it's both sides, but it's not both sides, because a far left contingency doesn't exist in our national politics. So we're not negotiating from these two extremes. We're negotiating from the far right and somewhere in the middle. A good idea that's kind of incomplete, but it could work. And then you're negotiating with crazy, and then you meet somewhere in the middle, and it's hurting us because we're not getting good policy out of that.
Any other thoughts on?
I mean, I don't come at it from a particular professional or academic standpoint. Yeah. I'm a preacher's kid, so my mindset is to quote my mother, and just like, everybody's just sick. We're just sick. But I say that jokingly, but there was a recent, and I don't want to misquote it, so I'm going to just say right now this is probably slightly off, but there was a report that came out a few weeks ago that was talking about returning Afghanistan vets, how in 2012 there were more suicides than there were actual combat deaths, right? Like there's this, and so that's another challenge our generation has, is that we've got people coming home from war so disconnected from our generation, and so disconnected from our communities, with who have no real understanding of what it means to be in combat. So there's that. There's kind of been this recent spike, or at least spike in the attention given to young rappers and hip-hop artists committing suicide recently. There's kind of been 2 or 3 in the past month that I can just think of. And so I also worry a lot, regardless of what you think of Cornel West and Tavis Smiley, but their whole kind of poverty tour and trying to bring up the conversation about low-income communities, which has conveniently been left to the side in the Obama administration. What's going on there? Yeah. And not to pathologize and say, oh, these are sick communities, but when we neglect so many aspects of who we are, both as people and as a society, when we kind of just disconnect ourselves from veterans and disconnect ourselves from low-income folks, I genuinely worry, just as a human, not as a political thought leader, but as a human, what does that do to our mental health, and what does that really do to future generations and the children that we'll have?
Yes.
I think in general there's a lot of lack of education that people have around these issues, and I think that that's starting to become, through the sort of the conversations that people are having around gun violence prevention, around the recent mass shootings. I think that the issues of mental health and who has access to it and who doesn't have access to it are starting to become, you know, a part of the national conversation, which I think is really important, just as someone that like studied psychology formally and, you know, understands that these are services that are typically not allocated for specific communities or not accessible to specific communities. And so I think that that's something that I feel like a little bit inspired by in wake of all of these tragedies that have taken place in the last couple of months, really that have been taking place for a long time, right? That have just become a part of the national conversation. But I'm really looking forward to having more discussion around how do we make sure that more folks have access to these resources so that, you know, people are getting what they need.
Well, and I mean, just to piggyback on a lot of the ideas, I mean, my mother works in mental health, and that's been kind of a lot of my kind of household, you know, kind of issues. Yeah. And so when I hear you say kind of, you know, how would you diagnose even society at large? Well, yeah, clearly you run the gamut of all illnesses. But I think the biggest does come to these issues of just overall funding, right? So, I mean, our mental health system in general has been highly underfunded for decades. And, you know, so if we're adding to that all of these other, you know, kind of realities from war, from gun violence, from drugs to poverty, I mean, all of that just, you know, makes you question, okay, so how are we going to actually start providing the services and, you know, be conscious of all of the various, you know, cultural needs and all of that as, you know, our immigration, you know, and our immigrant population grows. I mean, it's a very large issue that I think is being overlooked, particularly when we talk about healthcare reform. But I think, you know, there is opportunity to, as, you know, Eddie was saying, to really educate folks, at least when we're talking about political kind of realities. And make sure that, you know, it doesn't become just an insider beltway conversation.
Yeah. Did you have a final comment?
I think that's one of my concerns with the issue of mental health arising in the wake of the shootings.
Yeah.
And that, you know, it feels like it could become a protect us from them type conversation in which we pathologize people with mental health and we victimize them further. And that's what I want us to be careful of, because most people with mental illnesses are more of a harm to themselves than they are to others. And so we have to keep that at the center of the conversation that we're talking about, because, you know, every time there's a mass shooting, we want to ascribe it to something. We want it to be something outside of ourselves so we don't have to take responsibility. And so if you can say this person has a mental illness, this person is crazy, but that's not the case. Most of these mass shootings take place and they're the cause of, you know, working class white men generally that are just, you know, humiliated, frustrated, feel jilted. Like that's what causes most of this. So if we can address that in terms of mass shootings, but absolutely make sure that we're taking into account the mental health conversation and make sure everyone has access to good mental health services. I think, you know, if that comes out of this, then I'm good. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I think in terms of kind of doing this national diagnosis or just thoughts of things that keep getting swept under the rug that we don't deal with, that just perpetuate the problem even more. I actually saw an article recently that was about Black women in depression, specifically the killer amongst us, because there's definitely the whole, you know, strong Black woman piece that then carries the burden of if there is something wrong or if there is depression, that you just kind of go through the motions of it because you have to show up for everybody else. And I feel like in some ways we're seeing that as a country and not properly dealing with, you know, the intersections of just identity and race and gender and sexual orientation, and just by not accepting, by still having so much discrimination and so much just issues around our history with slavery, and just not confronting so many of these inequalities, it just keeps perpetuating this kind of, oh, but we're just going to show up because we're this strong nation where you're supposed to be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And somehow if we recognize this history, then we have to deny this. And so it's until we can see that both can coexist that I feel like we're going to be able to get that healing and you know, the therapy can work. we can enter into therapy and like really properly go through that process. Okay, so we can obviously talk forever, but the time has come to wrap things up. So thank you all for your comments and your contributions and being here on this season premiere. It really means a lot to have you all present, so thank you so much. And you can all of their handles have been getting shouted out on Twitter at Know This TV, so be sure to check our page for their info to follow all of them. And thank you to our hosts here at Campus Campus Progress. I was doing something. Tara Kutz and team, they're at Campus Progress on Twitter. And thank you all for joining us online for this season 2 premiere. Subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow on Twitter, etc. You know the deal with that. And if you like what you see, please also consider donating to support our production, which I humbly like to call the little engine that could. And you can do that at knowthis.tv under the donate link. And if there's a key takeaway today, remember that your voice matters, not just on election days, but every day in voting, volunteering, and shaping the kind of country and world we want to live in. In other words, just to break it down, we have to keep showing up, y'all, because it's real out here. Really, really real. Crazy real. Yeah, as you can see that we just talked about. So if you didn't know all these interesting perspectives on politics, now you know. We'll be having these kinds of conversations every other Tuesday, so we will see you next time on February 5th back in New York City. That's all, folks. Thanks. Peace.